Hunter Biden found guilty, the jury quickly deliberating on those gun charges. Yes, they say, he did lie on a gun background check form about his drug use. The evidence for that is overwhelming. But the reality here is this thing was never going to get to this point were it not for the IRS whistleblowers who came forward and said there was a massive effort within the federal government to protect the Biden family from consequences whatsoever. For more on this, I want to bring in Tristan Leavitt now. He's the president of Empower Oversight and represents those IRS whistleblowers, Joseph Ziegler and Gary Shapley. Tristan, thank you so much for being back with us. Really appreciate it, sir.
Yeah, happy to be with you, Vince.
My immediate reaction today was the bare minimum here, and of course, many of us look at this and go, this is the bare minimum you could go after the Bidens for. We would not have even had this were it not for the IRS whistleblowers. Am I wrong?
No, that's absolutely right. If you look back at the beginning of 2023 through 2022, after the IRS had recommended these charges, the FBI had recommended charges, and DOJ had signed off on them, but David Weiss, the U.S. Attorney for the District of Delaware, had been convinced in one place after another that he shouldn't touch Hunter Biden. And so by the beginning of 2023, this was going nowhere. There would have been not even a plea deal, ironically, were it not for the whistleblowers saying this is outrageous, right? All these charges everybody agreed on, and now they are just going to let this whole thing die because of this political interference by appointees of President Biden. So you look at the timing, and it's very clear from the TikTok that the time that this all got, the apparatus started moving again was when the U.S. Attorney's Office in Delaware became aware that Gary Shapley and Joe Ziegler were going to make disclosures to Congress. And that's when they reached out. That's when they concocted the plea deal that they hastily assembled. And because it was so sloppily done, that's how you saw it fall apart in front of Judge Noriega. So everything that's happened since that time came just because these guys came forward to say, this is not right. This is what everybody agreed on. And now just because of this person is the president's son, nothing's going to happen.
I wonder, you and I have talked about it before, but the role that was played by the assistant U.S. attorney working for David Weiss, a woman called Leslie Wolf, because the IRS whistleblowers indicated that she was the one who was quite often telling them that they couldn't take these investigative steps that would go further, get anywhere near Joe Biden. She was responsible for alerting the Biden world ahead of major investigative actions that gave them the time to prepare themselves to prevent getting into any further legal jeopardy. And that she also was responsible for negotiating this sweetheart deal, which would end up before the court. But by the time it did end up before the court, she was taken off the case. What do you make of her role in all of this?
I have always found it fascinating ever since I learned about this. But when the documents, it both appeared, I can't remember if it was in the New York Times story or Politico story, but last year there were these stories that had very in-depth documents, clearly from, presumably one half from Hunter Biden's legal team and the other half from perhaps the U.S. Attorney's Office in Delaware. But either way, there's these documents out there. They've now been released to Congress and made their way to various places. So I've seen some of these. And you can see that on May 15th, which is the day that the IRS agents were taken off the case. So April of 2023 was when our team wrote a letter to Congress saying that Gary Shapley wanted to come forward. He wasn't named, but obviously the people in Delaware knew exactly, based on what was in that letter, knew exactly what it was about. And so then you move forward to May 15th when they were taken off. And that's the day that, after hearing nothing from the prosecutors, Hunter Biden's team gets this contact from Leslie Wolf, who offers them a plea deal where he has to plead guilty to nothing whatsoever. And I can't remember if it's a week after that or 2 weeks after that, that she comes back in the emails and says, well, we checked with David Weiss and he said that we need to change it a little bit. You have to at least plead guilty to this. And I just thought it was so interesting that she was willing to just hand it all over there. And they came back to David Weiss, and I can only imagine he says, well, this looks terrible. You have to at least make him plead guilty to something. And then what the world saw as the sweetheart plea deal was less sweet than the original offer from Leslie Wolf. It just boggles my mind.
Yeah, mine too. So when you hear all of these major media figures today saying that this is a sign that the American system works, that justice is blind, that Joe Biden put the country before his own family, what do you think?
I think that is a complete load of garbage. I think the American system, were it not for these whistleblowers, would have completely failed the American justice system because, this is not how prosecutors are supposed to act. These are not the kinds of considerations that are supposed to be taken into account when making prosecutorial decisions or investigative decisions, but they clearly did in this case, and it's only because someone's last name was Biden. And so all of this commentary is just very misplaced, I think. Anybody that looks back at the timeline can see that were it not for these whistleblowers, you very much would have had someone getting, special treatment, that
Yes.
the second tier of justice that you get if you're related to the President of the United States.
So, and as the IRS whistleblowers were dealing with this investigation, as I recall, they were getting frustrated because the investigation was moving so slowly that the statutes of limitations were beginning to run out on the most important years. Is that right?
Yes, the key real statute of limitations that expired was from a very deliberate decision by David Weiss, and so that related to the 2014 and 2015 years. But yeah, that's right. Throughout 2022, as they were not getting close to that, I think an important factor to remember there is that the statute of limitations would have run out already were it not for a tolling agreement with the defense. So that was an option. Hunter Biden's team was willing to keep stringing that out. The hope, if you're a defendant, is by agreeing to extend the statute of limitations, it gives you more time to convince prosecutors as to why you shouldn't be charged. Whereas if you force them to make a snap decision, they're going to come after you most likely. And so they had already indicated they were willing to extend the tolling agreement, to extend the statute of limitations. And it was just David Weiss that just made a straight up decision that he wasn't going to do that anymore. He was just going to let those years with all the foreign income there from Ukraine and some of the other places, the $1 million Burisma paychecks, he was going to let all that expire. And that was the beginning of the real breach between him and when Gary Shapley first said, first blew the whistle. And ever since then, David Weiss has clearly had it out for Gary Shapley.
In your experience, how unusual is that? A defendant says, I'm willing to extend the statute of limitations, and the government prosecutor says, no, in fact, we're just going to let it lapse?
I mean, it's extremely unusual, and the circumstances here come after, those years would have had to be brought in D.C. You have a U.S. attorney in D.C., Matthew Graves, who was appointed by President Biden, and this has been investigated now by the House committees, but you have this situation where Weiss goes to them, and Graves bends over backwards to try and convince Weiss that it's a bad idea. And so Weiss says, oh, it's my idea. Today in the press conference, he thanked Merrick Garland for giving him such independence, but you can just see Weiss is blowing whichever way the wind goes. And at that point, he had just been convinced that, well, it just doesn't make sense. We're going to go ahead and just let this lapse.
It's just amazing. I want to move on to another issue that you're in the news for this week because you're doing such great work over Empower Oversight, and it involves an FBI whistleblower who apparently his colleagues were questioned about whether or not he was a supporter of Donald Trump's. What can you tell us about that story?
So this is an individual who's not been public. Unlike Marcus Allen, last week we had this total vindication for him, one of the FBI whistleblowers that I testified alongside the weaponization subcommittee with. There are several of these FBI whistleblowers we've represented who've been public, and this is not one of those. Because unlike those other individuals who just objected within the FBI to how it was conducting its January 6th investigations, this is somebody who went downtown in Washington, D.C. to hear President Trump speak. When President Trump said go to the Capitol, he went to the Capitol, but he's very much a rule follower. He's someone that didn't go inside the Capitol. He's someone that didn't engage in any violence. But he disclosed the day after January 6th to his supervisor that he'd been there. He'd been entirely peaceful, didn't engage in anything, but left when it looked like it looked like there were problems there. Mm-hmm. And so a year later, he came under into the suspicion funnel of the security division within the FBI. And to be fair, again, he had been down there, so it's legitimate for them to start investigating and asking around about that. He's passed a polygraph saying he didn't go inside, didn't engage in any violence. But what we've now learned, because the FBI didn't seem to have believed him, right? They've moved forward and they've taken these actions. So looking through his security file, what we've discovered is that instead of asking questions of his colleagues just about his attendance that day or anything else, they asked them first, in these interviews, they would tell them you were required to answer or your own security clearance could be in jeopardy. And then they asked them the context of their knowing him and whether they had socialized with him. So they're including asking things about outside of the workplace. And then they asked whether he ever vocalized support for President Trump, whether he ever vocalized objection to the COVID-19 vaccine. These are things that are totally unrelated to anyone's job at the FBI. totally inappropriate for them to be asking about, and particularly in the context of an investigation into whether or not he should continue to have a security clearance. So this is a huge deal, and we are hearing that it's part of, as we have a lot of whistleblowers come to us, it's part of a bigger pattern that the security division really did have these political biases. And once people came to their attention, being referred from somewhere in the FBI, those biases really impacted the types of questions that they asked and how they drummed people out of the FBI for having just conservative views or views that those in the leadership of the FBI didn't align with.
Yeah, I mean, you have here that he was the president of the United States. So if you had an FBI agent signaling that he was supportive of the president of the United States, that would be held against him.
Yeah, this was all after. This is all after. This is while President Biden is the president. But yeah, that's significant, and we think it's also, the timeline is interesting because at this point, there was a time when a lot of FBI agents were making hard decisions because there was the vaccine mandate and they didn't want to receive the vaccine. Well, by the time these questions were asked of our clients' coworkers, this was 3 months after the federal vaccine mandate had been, there was an injunction on that. So there was zero reason whatsoever for them to be asking these kinds of questions. When I led an agency called the Merit Systems Protection Board during the Trump administration, when there was the initiation of well, I guess this stemmed over. So it's an independent agency. I was there also during the beginning of the Biden administration. Mm-hmm. When the vaccine came out initially, we had to be extremely careful about where that information goes because it's people's private health information. And so to the extent that needed to be gathered, there was a lot of discussion of how do you do this? How do you make sure that this isn't just strewn about the agency? In this case, for the security division to be asking about it is completely inappropriate.
And these are political litmus tests. They're merely, has he expressed something that the average Republican might express? Because the questions that didn't include things like, has he voiced support for BLM? I don't see that on the list.
That's right. And the most clear analog for, the vaccine here would be, imagine how outraged Democrats would be if the FBI in a future administration asked people, have you ever heard your coworker voice any support for receiving an abortion? That's just not appropriate. That's just not the place for the FBI to be snooping around into the personal views of its employees.
Okay. And lastly, his status as a whistleblower, is it possible to share what he's blowing the whistle on? Is it his own experience here of being targeted by the FBI? What is it that he's been revealing?
Yes, it's just his own experience. So again, that's part of why he's somewhat differently postured than other folks that we have represented that had disclosures that were unrelated to their own retaliation. So in those cases, we have brought to the public, these things that were being disclosed by them here. This is part of why we've been working with this individual for over a year, but it's all been behind the scenes. But as we got that file and saw this, then, even though he has no desire to be a public person, but he acknowledged this was a big deal and we needed to bring this to the public's attention.
Yeah, the FBI questioning whether FBI agents have, quote, vocalized support for President Trump. This is dangerous. Tristan Leavitt at Empower Oversight, thank you, sir, for all of your excellent work and your time as always.